right now, let's talk about something that's going to end with another beginning in 2 weeks, because the Muhammadu Buhari administration will come to an end with the swearing in of a new government. So, but the conversation is still ongoing as to how well this administration performed, what were the promises made, how far so far. This morning, the focus is on the administration's human rights and public accountability performance. And to join us in that conversation this morning is Oluwadare Kolawole, who is Deputy Director, Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project, SERAP. He's a good governance advocate, he's a human rights lawyer, and he joins us right here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let's begin with that we saw on the front page of This Nigeria, which is a report of your communication to the World Bank about the proposed $800 million loan, which, according to Kari, of course, with the conversation with the World Bank representative in Nigeria, has been approved, but has not been given. What exactly informed that letter?
Thank you very much. So I'm happy that, according to Coyote, that the said loan is yet to be disbursed. It's approved. And the articles of agreement and the various rules that govern the World Bank allows it to rescind its decision. And we're happy that at this point, those funds are yet to be disbursed. And the issues are quite simple, really. It's the twilight of this administration. They spent 7 years, almost 8 years now, and then they want to borrow. And if you look at the trajectory, at least from what we have in the public space, the government had come out in April that this loan was supposed to be the palliatives for the subsidy removal, which again this government has said they are not doing any longer. So naturally, are those funds still required? And that is within the context of our growing debt profile, faced with coupled with the lack of accountability for even the loans we've gotten in the past, and even the windfalls that we've gotten, for instance, from the Abacha loot that we've gotten severally under this administration. And that is why we've taken that step to ensure that if at all this loan is going to be disbursed, Nigerians have the right to know, to understand what it's being used for. And really, there is no basis for that loan at the present. But the same government is saying now that those funds will be used to pay millions of Nigerians 5,000 per month to lift them out of poverty. So the question is, what has the government been doing for 8 years? The MPS report mentions how hundreds, millions of Nigerians rather, are still living in poverty. It's just not, it's not adding up, so to speak.
But it's clear. I mean, you also said that they were clear about the objectives, that it's going to be used to pay palliatives.
There are conflicting objectives now. One was subsidy removal, then they turned around to say
originally, the whole idea has always been pay about 50 million Nigerians 5,000 naira monthly for 6 months. That was you don't think it's
that data that supports that payment that has been done in the past has lifted any Nigerian out of poverty. And really, one needs to not be a professor in economics to understand. If you pay such amount every month, the growing level of inflation around the goods that they need, power, electricity, education, health, of course, is going to take all this up. It is just, if you ask me, this is just another way to ensure that this money is possibly end up in the wrong pocket. We've not gotten accountability for the ones we've gotten in the past. Why should every Nigerian owe again? I saw the news reports this morning. Guardian is attributing more than 300,000 naira to every Nigerian for that vote, and then it's going to rise again. For what purposes? Really, it doesn't stand to reason.
Well, the World Bank, in that conversation I had with the country director, says they have, rules as to how funds like this will be dispersed. So they're not just given the funds, so they'll ensure that they follow through with how the funds are dispersed. Because I know it's a major talking point, how will these funds be dispersed? But this is a situation the government finds itself in. If subsidies are removed by June, I mean, there's a 2023 budget already, and it captures subsidy up until June. But the projection is if it is not removed by June, Nigeria will be spending over 5 trillion naira on subsidy, at least 2 trillion if it's removed by June, but 5 trillion if it's not removed by June. So the government finds itself in that situation where revenues are not enough. Even if the World Bank does not give Nigeria the loan, Nigeria will still have to try to find the money from somewhere else, at least to sort the budget. So are you saying that this government should not be the one taking the loan, it should be the next government, or we should not take this loan altogether?
The answer is very simple. Government should not take this loan until the same government who canvass for votes from Nigerians are able to convince Nigerians why we need these loans. And one of the very important things they should do is not only to explain the use of the loan, to show how funds in the past, whether internally generated or loan, has been spent. And Nigerians have not seen that. And the laws are quite clear, including the Articles of Agreement of the World Bank, as to what binds the World Bank, how those funds are to spend, our fiscal responsibility, for instance, about how those funds should be spent. Nigerians have not seen that. We've seen money come in and end up in private pockets. So how can government justify another huge borrowing on the pretext of lifting Nigerians out of poverty when we've not gotten explanations for how the funds in the past have been spent? Abacha loot is a case in point. Billions of dollars have come in. How have they been spent?
So is that to say you're not satisfied with the assurance the government gave over time that they were all diverted into infrastructure?
Of course. Serap is not satisfied, and I dare say most Nigerians are not, because it is a very core function of government to explain to Nigerians. And I say this as part of the electoral process. They do come to Nigerians, they make promises, they give data, they speak. So it means they understand that aspect of their job. But when they come into offices, they still need to convince Nigerians why they need to take every step.
I'm sorry, Gowdy, I punctuated your line of questioning, but to that, perhaps the issue here is not whether or not government is accountable to people. Perhaps the issue is whether or not people believe that government is accountable, because from time to time we always hear, okay, this is what we are doing with this, that's what we're doing with that. Is it a problem of conviction or a problem of not reporting at all?
I would say it's a challenge of experience, and experience trumps knowledge, really, because people have seen, they've experienced government for years, since 1999 at least, in case in point, and for the past 8 years they have experienced this administration. We've had of budgets every year, huge amounts of money. We've seen deficit, we understand.
It's the same story with every government.
But it's not translating to anything on
It's
ground.
the same story we've heard since 1999.
Exactly. So people have the right to demand to know how these funds have been spent. And for instance, look at the budgetary allocation for this year, 2023 budget. The National Assembly is getting over 200 billion naira. For what purposes? How much is the allocation to health, to education, in terms of recurrent expenditure instead of capital expenditure? What about the huge amounts of money spent on security votes nationwide, including from the president down? And these are things, and that's what I'm speaking to experience, that would convince the average Nigerian that these funds are being judiciously spent. But that is not seen. And even when organizations like Sarah ask questions, we do not get answers. We end up in court. We have more than 25 cases in court based on the freedom of information request. And what does it mean? It means we are simply asking government questions that we have a right to ask as citizens, and we do not get answers. And we have the Attorney General defending these cases in court. What it simply means is that government is in court defending an action why they should not give citizen information, and now funds and other administrative steps have been taken. And this is the government that comes to canvass for votes, that releases information that seems harmless. But why don't we get information on those things that are very important? So this $800 billion, why can't the government convince us in the reality with fact and figures to show how these funds will be spent, what it will do for the average Nigerian, and steps that would ensure that it doesn't go the way of those in the past? It's just simple.
I think you touched on a very important point. Yes, the $800 million conversation would definitely go on, and I think for the vulnerable Nigerians, 50 million or 10 million households, I think there will be that question about whether or not they even want it in the first place. Some will say, well, it's good for them if you're to remove the price, or at least the palliative in terms of subsidy. You should find a way to return it to their lives. So I know that conversation is on. But when you talk about asking for vital information, seeking accountability from government, transparency, and you do not get those answers, I want you to lay those issues bare. Who do you demand these information from? Is it a ministry? Is it a particular department that you're not getting the answer? So that Nigerians are on the same page. They are clear on who to put pressure on, because government is meant to be accountable to us.
The laws that guide this, they are very clear, they are very simple, and it doesn't contain a lot of legalese. So for instance, Section 39 of the Constitution says clearly that every Nigerian has a right to freedom of expression. And what it means that what we are doing presently is part of that right. It means to impart and to receive. And then the Freedom of Information Act is an act of the National Assembly passed in 2011 that mandates public institutions. And public institutions means the presidency, from the presidency down to every public institution, including private institutions that are funded by public funds, to proactively keep and disclose information, which is why, for instance, you go to the website of the Debt Management Office this morning, you will see the entire public debt stock of Nigeria. You see information about those things. Why do we as Nigerians know how much we owe, but we do not know enough about how those funds have been spent? And so the FOI mandates institutions to keep information and to provide it to all Nigerians upon demand. And the law is so good that it doesn't even require the demand and to be in writing. But SERAP has gone a step further to write. And we've written to the presidency, we've written to the National Assembly, we've written to virtually any MDA you can think of in Nigeria, basically asking simple questions, information.
And none of them have responded.
Very few. And I'd say the return rate, a positive return rate is less than 2%, and which is why we end up in court.
So let's imagine you sent letters, I'm just saying hypothetically, to 100, only 2 have responded.
Yes, positive responses. Positive responses.
What do you mean?
The response rate is about 9%. A response can be, we are not giving you, we don't have it, it's with another MDA, and then the positive response will be providing the information sort, including a part of it. And so that is what is at 2%.
But so you're saying that 91% do not respond at all?
Yes. And really, we shouldn't be surprised. We've seen the Auditor General annually reel out reports indicting MDAs of government for not opening their books and accounting for how much they spent. Why, if they do not respond to the Auditor General, really, why would they respond to Sarah?
So help us understand what may be happening behind the scenes if you're not getting the information from 91%, let's say. What are the possibilities of what's going on behind the scenes? Because I mean, you can't see, but what are those possibilities?
And one of them is, there's a very good example, the NDDC, for instance. President Muhammadu Buhari had ordered a forensic audit of the NDDC. That shouldn't have happened if, for instance, there are accountability mechanisms that ensure that citizens can demand information and know. And what was the outcome? Even though the report hasn't been published, that the NDDC has more than 300 accounts, according to the report. Shouldn't that have been discovered earlier? And those are the kinds of information that should be in the public domain. So without information, you would understand. A lot could be going on, and we wouldn't know.
But I will find that very curious, and here is why. And thank you very much for that question, Kayode. Because it is the responsibility of the National Assembly, at least 2 committees, one in the Senate, one in the House of Representatives, to perform these oversights and ensure that these information that you're asking for are given, to ensure accountability of the ministries, departments, and agencies. So essentially you're saying if the federal government's ministries, departments, and agencies, which the Budget Office DG put at more than 1,400 in all, if they are not doing what they're supposed to do, making information available, it means that the National Assembly themselves are indicted because they are supposed to perform these functions. They're supposed to make sure that they give this information. Isn't that so?
We have a case against the National Assembly presently in court, another FOI request. Basically, the question we asked the National Assembly was, we've seen a lot of corruption probes. Can Nigerians know the outcomes of those corruption probes? We didn't get a response, and we're in court. And you would think that is very simple. That has no financial consequence, so to speak. We simply ask the question, can you give us details of how many corruption probes have been instituted by the National Assembly, the processes taken, and the outcomes? Who has been indicted? Which steps have been taken on it? We didn't get a response. And so those are the challenges we are facing for the constitutional right that's been granted to Nigerians to know and to have information. So what they do with that information is not the government.
Essentially, you're saying that this government is not accountable.
Of course, that's what it
by
means.
Percentage. I mean, you give a percentage of it.
By the response rate to SERAP's FOI request, and that is one. The second is the amount of public information in the public domain. So I've given you an example of the DMO. You see the number of deaths, but really that's not enough.
It's very interesting because there's this fact sheet of the government's achievement from when it came into power, and I'm sure you've seen. There's actually a fact sheet. It chronicles some of those things, and open transparency is one of the key points there. Open government partnership, for example, saying that the president, pledged that Nigeria will join the open government partnership, and in 2016, Nigeria became the 70th country to join open government. I've been to that. There's this website where you can actually get some of the details. At some point it was down. I've not gone back to check it, but these are some of the things that the government speaks about. Asset recovery, for example, the PACAC and all of that. So for this government, it actually speaks highly of itself when it comes to accountability, transparency. But you know what? My colleague Marwe has questions for you. Imagine Neil Tatu. Over to you guys.
Well, we're still keeping tabs on the cookathon going on, which you can follow up, on YouTube, and you can also see right here on. I think we just have about 2 minutes left to the breaking of that record. So just to, put that out there. But let me quickly come back to the conversation we're having. Oh, yes, indeed, you can see that. I mean, her spirits are still up. But let's take a look at let's take a look at some of the visuals that we're seeing right there. People are still cheering her up, rooting for her, pushing for her. A few minutes more right now to the breaking of the world record. Hear the song.
I think she's broken the record. She is right now. I think she's going to be able to set her own record. And of course, Nigerians are happy. Look at the amazing thing. While this was happening, there were people outside, under the rain, dancing, celebrating, and of course, the Nigerian spirits there. See, Nigerians just love Nigerians.
Indeed, we do.
Nigerians just love Nigeria.
Our fan clubs can be the biggest, the noisiest.
Yes.
And if you listen to a football match being played, you know when Nigerians are in the stadium, you cannot miss their fan club.
And guess what?
And Hilda certainly has some on her side.
If you go through the crowd there is no from north, south, there's no north, south, east, or west in that space.
Indeed.
What you have in there amongst the people out there hooting for Hilda Bassi are people who are Nigerians.
Indeed.
Not Yoruba, not Igbo, not Hausa, not Efik, not Ibibio, not Yako. It's Nigerians that are there, not Egu. It's Nigerians that are there hooting for that young lady who has broken the world record. And of course, as they'll say, the Guinness Book of Records will have to validate this, and then hopefully we'll be there to see the presentation of that plaque to say she has broken the record for the longest cooking hours in history.
Indeed. I mean, as the VP said earlier, we'll push forward our own, but right now we're telling ourselves some home truths, and the home truth is that we need some more accountability. We're coming back to the studio now. We're coming back to the conversation we're having with Mr. Kolawole on accountability and what exactly is happening with the loans which the federal government is proposing to take. What have they done in the past, and what would they do in the future? So let's come back to this conversation now. I'm going to be drawing on the earlier questions asked about that proposed $800 million loan, which the federal government is intending to take from the World Bank, which was initially planned to cushion the effect of the removal of subsidy. We've since been told that the new administration will come and remove, or they're going to leave that decision to the new administration to decide. But people are still asking questions, why then are you still going ahead with getting the $800 million loan? Right now, as we know it, the National Assembly has now received a request, or a request for approval from the executive arm of government. It's now before the National Assembly to give this approval. We have been following up on that discussion here for you. And I want to know what our guest here, Mr. Oluwadare Kolawole, thinks about, disbursement. At the end of the day, some people will say that when you sometimes give a loan, you sometimes want to see how the loan which you've given is being used. Do you think that the World Bank will be willing to give out a loan if it is not certain that the loan is going to be used for the purpose for which it was intended?
Thank you very much, Mokwe. The World Bank's role in this is different from what the citizens' own point of view will be. And that is why you see, from the news report we saw on Guardian this morning, for instance, he has signed over 300,000 to each Nigerian. None of that was assigned to World Bank. This would affect us, whether positively or negatively. And that is why we Nigerians are asking the hard questions in this instance. And for SERAP, this is very contextual. We have experienced this. We are presently in court over 2 FOI requests to this same administration about how the social protection program funds have been spent and the various loans that have been gotten in the past. If we did not get a response to those questions and the information is not available in the public domain, how are we sure that these loans, these $800 million will be spent accountably and transparency for the benefit of Nigerians? And to answer your question simply, yes, the World Bank, they do have an obligation under the Articles of Agreement, that's Article 3, that allows them to ensure that the funds are spent for the purposes for which they are disbursed. And that includes, that is majorly for reconstruction and development. And that is contextual, really. While the Nigerian government could have made various could have told the World Bank a lot of things about how the funds will be used. We, the Nigerian people who will benefit or suffer the consequences, we hold the highest stake, and we should ask questions that we're asking presently.
Okay, well, I did also speak with a few other members of civil society on Friday, had a conversation with them on this, and one of them was of the view that perhaps we should hold a public hearing. Do you think that would help with the level of, especially now that the request for approval is now before the National Assembly, do you think that would help in any way, holding a public hearing before that approval is granted, if it will be granted?
I cannot think of any circumstances where this has happened in the past, but it is not a bad thing entirely. Understanding the various mechanisms. But the President, the Executive, the National Assembly, they add the legislature, they make the laws, they approve in this instance such a request for loans. And it is all designed as part of the checks and balances to ensure that power is not absolute in one arm of government. So it would not be out of place if that should happen. But primarily, because at the public hearing, Nigerians will be asking the hard questions. Why can't we ask the Executive, and in this instance, the President, since he's the one making the request, to justify to Nigerians, not the National Assembly, why this loan needs to be taken, and as part of that is to justify how the ones in the past have been spent, and that goes to the various issues of governance, including even the cost of running the State House and all that, and that is why I say that the executive have not been forthcoming with information on governance, particularly when it comes to our financial obligations and spending.
Yes, sir.
You know, your age organization continues to push for accountability, and you mentioned a couple of times how you're still in court over the FOI asking government to account for the way they spend some of the monies that have already been taken. But if you look at, I mean, there's been a list, I have a list here of about 20 achievements of the this current administration, and one of those things is the infrastructure Infrastructure Corporation of Nigeria that was set up to look at the provision of infrastructure across the country, and the government prides itself in carrying on the biggest infrastructure project in the history of Nigeria. Yet you still argue that they've not done enough in terms of accountability for the monies that have been, the loans that have been taken and monies generated. What else do you want the government to do?
Delivering on outcomes of governance is a totally different concept from the process of governance itself. And accountability speaks to the process. Of course, we know that affects the outcome ultimately, but the process is. So it is not enough, for instance, for a government to say that we have done bridges or built roads or built schools. How much did it cost? How can we relate that to the budget? And then this speaks to the allocation in the budget cycle. What is recurrent, what is capital expenditure? So perhaps, and perhaps what we are getting as infrastructure pales in comparison to what goes on as recurrent expenditure, mostly to public officers. And that speaks to security vote and pension. And speaking of pension, in the next couple of months, when the new governors come in, Nigerians would spend more billions of naira across more than 22 states, paying governors and deputy governors, those that have left office, billions of naira as part of the pension laws. And so this goes to accountability, including the president himself, to ensure that they are accountable for all these funds that have been spent. So it is not enough to do infrastructure. Of course, that is a necessary outcome of government. It is to explain to the Nigerian people why we need to do this, how it was spent, which is why we have budget performance cycles, quarter 1, quarter 2, up to quarter 4, to know how much is coming, how has it been spent. And this is not curious to government. This has been on. It's part of the democratic process, that as part of the electioneering, they come to make promises. They talk about processes. And then when they get in the office, they need to continue in that process of governance to ensure that the people get the utmost benefit of governance.
Okay, so that bit about getting the utmost benefits of governance, let's look at the cost as against expenses. Is it about how much a project costs? Or let's just say the building of a road is about $1 billion. Are you interested in the process of expending that $1 billion or the process of actually determining the cost of that road? Which one is it that Serap is interested in?
This is not really about Serap, this is about all Nigerians. So if you, for instance, the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway that's been constructed, it is not enough to see that the road is being constructed. How much was being constructed for? What is the process? And this is not, again, this is part of the processes of the law, which is why the Public Procurement Act has various processes when it comes to expenditure. Who is getting what, when, and how? Is there a bidding process? How much was it? Is the person who get the highest bid, did he get the job? And so these are the kind of questions that goes into the process. And all these, they are put into this governance process to ensure that corruption is at the barest minimum and the people get the utmost benefits of governance, which is what governance is about ultimately, really. So it's not about the cost, it is about the process, while knowing that the process, of course, naturally influences the cost.
Well, one of the other issues that we should really mention is that of human rights. Thankfully, you are a human rights lawyer. Well, of course, that's not to say that we've exhausted all the questions on public accountability, because that really is a thing. But then, even in terms of human rights, accountability is an issue as well. I'm almost certain that, I mean, in that list of fact checks that you saw, because I also saw the same thing, I'm almost certain we'll find some human rights pat on the back by the federal government, because the AGF already cited the example of the Apple 6 and said, look, federal government did this, and it's the first government in Nigeria to be that responsive in terms of human rights and all of that. Of course, coming up with a 6-point or action plan of something like that, in terms of human rights. Is that something significant for you?
Of course, but we've been talking about human rights all along, because access to information is a right derivable from the freedom of expression. So we cannot remove this, and that is why in law, those human rights are contagious. They influence one another. You cannot take away somebody's right to freedom of expression and say you're enabling to the right to life. It is combined, it is interwoven. So freedom of expression is a right. So what you're simply talking about is another aspect of human rights. For instance, you're talking about the right to life and all those things, and freedom from torture and all that as provided in Chapter 4 of the Constitution. But with a government that has not provided a good socio-economic environment for citizens to thrive, that itself is an abuse of human rights. And that is why it is not enough to get loans in this instance and spend them, you need to explain. So if the loans are well used to build hospitals, for instance, that would further your right to life. The same way you don't want law enforcement agencies to treat you badly or to kill you or unjustifiably. Also, if the government provides amenities, then maybe, perhaps, instances of cholera will go down. People do not have to die. So these rights are interwoven. So we do not have to focus on the right to law enforcement agencies as in looking at those rights. They are holistic. And that is why scoring this administration's performance on human rights, it's abysmally low.
And particularly when you look at the freedom of information, which you say is tied to freedom of expression, right? And which other particular rights are you speaking to for this government?
We started from the right to freedom of expression, which goes to the loan disbursement. But for the other aspects of rights, the right to life, for instance. So when you look at those economic rights, which is why they are very important and they're inserted in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, but they are also tied to Chapter 4, which is the part that is justiciable. Without that enabling environment for people to thrive, you really cannot enjoy those other rights. For instance, it's a right in the Constitution that you have the right to own property in any part of Nigeria. Without a good economy, you can't even afford to have money to even rent a house. How much more own property? Which is why those rights are contiguous and they link to each other. So the Nigerian government has this primary duty, which is why the Constitution is very clear, that the primary role of government is security and the welfare of the people. Without creating that environment, they are infringing on the rights of people already. Those other rights are just manifestations of the abuse that government has foisted on Nigeria.
You know, looking at that data sheet or fact sheet, as the case may be, I just did a quick search of rights.
Can you share this? I really don't know.
Oh, definitely. I will, from 2015 to 2023. Oh. And I mean, what I saw about rights was maybe copyright, right of way. There was no specific talk about human rights, but, you know, breaking it down, infrastructure, railroads, air, seaports, you know, there's talk about economy, health, and all of that. But, you know, 2 weeks to the end of this administration means 2 weeks to the start of another administration. Yes, government is a continuum, but we have heads, different heads per time. So do you have expectations? Do you have agenda that you want to set, particularly for those areas we discussed, transparency, and then the rights as well? Do you have expectations and agenda that you want to set?
Of course. The kind of work we do at SERAP will not be possible without hope, which is why we engage and advocate that we cannot afford to be cynical. We need to continue to engage. Of course, we have hope. And one of the key areas we mention is the rule of law, which is very important, which, by the way, this administration has failed woefully. And that means establishing, strengthening institutions so that they are able to do their work. And that means implementing the laws in a way that institutions are able to carry out the duties that are meant to do. And a very integral part of that is obeying the judgments of the court, which again speaks to human rights. An individual cannot go to court, spend 2 or 3 years in court, get judgment, and it's not enforced. And majorly, government is a major culprit in this instance. SERAP, for instance, has more than 11 judgments against government, not only this administration, by the way, and none of which has been enforced.
How many for this administration?
For this administration, we have 2. And for instance, and I'll mention this very important one, the pension law. The pension law judgment that was got, and it's very sad. I don't know whether you've seen this report. Honorable Justice Oguntoyi of the Federal High Court, and she had given this as part of her valedictory speech when she was leaving. She retired earlier 2 months ago, and she had said that was one of the things she has felt was painful for her because that judgment wasn't enforced. And the judgment was very simple. It directed the Attorney General to challenge the legality of state pension laws and to recover those funds that have been unlawfully paid. Do you know how much that would be? That would be billions, if not trillions of naira. And then would there be a need to borrow? But again, that judgment is yet to be enforced.
Well, there's too many issues to really raise on this, as I said. But, you know, maybe we're just opening the can and sometimes
worms.
Visit an agenda setting, review and preview for the next government. But for now, we have to thank you very much. Oluwadare Kolawole is Deputy Director of Socioeconomic Rights and Accountability Project. He is a good governance advocate and human rights lawyer. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.